All right, everybody, let's get going. So your next assignment is, it's sort of growing on all of the very fundamental things that we spoke about before. So we created a draft render of an interior space. We kind of set a specific camera position. We learned a little bit about lights. In this particular module, we're starting to get into a little bit more image composition and a little bit more lighting design. But we have to really understand some of the differences between interior and exterior lighting conditions. So I've basically created a site for you, and there's a place for you to develop a design. And we're going to develop the design and render it in a few different scales in order to achieve a few different objectives in the rendering and representation process, right? So common theme here in this class is that we're looking at things from start to finish, okay? And we're sort of rapid prototyping using rendering as a way of visualizing our design process. So in the assignment, you'll see basically, the description you can read, but the important part is like what we're going to do, right? So week one, we're going to look at charretting. So we're starting the design process. It's going to happen very quickly. I'm going to give you guys maybe only an hour or an hour and a half to develop a design. And then from there, we're pretty much taking it forward. So the reason we're designing in a very fast timeline is because I want you to understand different scales of rendering and how that might help you at different phases of design, if that makes any sense, and which ones might be more appropriate to use. So in order to study this, we're actually going to be rendering two different types of renderings all at this, at various stages. It's really only two different stages essentially. So we're going to have week one is going to be sort of charretting the design. We're going to develop a little bit of architecture. We're going to set the scene, and we're going to get ready to create our draft renders. Week two is the composition of that scene. So we might actually start exploring a few different camera angles, and then we're going to look at a few different lighting conditions, and we're going to try to identify what is the most appropriate type of representation for certain cases, right? And then week three is really nailing down that illumination factor. So we're going to study how we're using the focal length of our camera, how we're illuminating the space, how we're controlling the sky settings, and altogether what makes the right render for the right purpose. So let's kind of jump down actually to the deliverables at the bottom. You'll see that, well, can't, well, anyway, let me make it real big, I suppose. Still kind of down the bottom. But anyway, it says masking render and a final render, okay? But that's going to happen in both a studio and a full-scale model. So we modeled a few things before, but we did it in a really quick fashion, just so you could understand the difference in the scale of lighting. So in this case, we're actually going to look at a massing render, which is something that happens very early in the design process, right? Like schematic design, like your first couple weeks of your design studio classes, right? And a final render. And we're going to create a full scale and a model scale render of each, and really try to understand, which bits and pieces of it are effective and which ones are not. Okay, so think of it as sort of a clinical study of the effects of rendering throughout different stages of the process. Is that clear? Okay, so let's talk about the components here. This is really the extent of your design prompt. And like most other things in my classes, the design side of things is very minimalist. I don't want you to focus a lot on, this high level of design theory. So I'd like you to keep it very simple. All we're going to do is just develop, it's a rather large space, but you don't need to think about it too much. It's 35,000 square feet of exhibition and shared workspace, which means it's primarily just 35,000 square feet of open space. Okay, but it is on kind of a small site, and when we get into the model and I introduce you to that, you'll see why. But this, what I want you to really get down to is just picking an architectural typology, or a tectonic of building design, and just go with it. right? So you pick something, you rapid prototype, and you go with it, and you pick one, and then we're moving forward in the design process, okay? That part is really primarily there just to simulate the design process, okay? So don't get too hung up on it. So that would be stuff like exposed, like developing a building that has exposed structural principles, volumetric expression, or, you know, intercollision, or whatever Iggy calls it nowadays with Archibabble. But, you know, folding, pleating, that kind of stuff that you've studied in your studios, or even for some of you who have done the Grasshopper class, you could do something that's algorithmic in nature, okay? So pretty simple things. I want you to complete it in 1.5 hours. So like I said, short time frame, we're going to develop an architectural tectonic and typology and just go with it. And then we're going to basically just start simulating the design process from there, okay? So the specific requirements then are that your building has to be 75 feet high, no higher, and that 60% of the facade is going to be open or glazed. The total floor area somewhere between, you know, like 5% plus or minus 35,000 square feet, and the renderings must show the entire building. And then finally, that part, this last little line item right here is what I think is the most important part of this whole assignment, okay? The detail level guidelines, okay? I say guidelines because the design process is going to look a little different for everyone in all cases, so I'll never say that you have to do exactly this in your design process, okay? So take it with a grain of salt, but it probably will look something like this. Here in week 1, we're massing out the building. We're starting to understand where we're going to have some glazing planes, and then that's pretty much it for week 1. We're going to do some scene setting and preparation stuff too. Week 2 is where you're going to, you know, as we're developing the renders, you're also developing, you know, the detail level of your glazing elements, the detail level of some of your architectural elements, if you have any, and really just making, you know, breathing life into the building, similar to the way you would develop an architectural design in your studio courses, right? And then finally, in week 3, you're adding even more detail. So now you're getting down to, you know, if you need to show hardware, you're modeling hardware. If you need to show handrails and guardrails and you know, guy wires and suspension cables and all that other kind of stuff, you're actually modeling those at that stage. All at the same time that we're finalizing our rendering technique and really being able to understand how this architecture should be represented. Does that make sense? Something you guys can subscribe to, you think? Cool.
Thank you. Question.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to quickly introduce you to the massing model, I suppose, and then we'll get going. So let me make sure I'm showing you where everything is. So right here, in the same folder that I placed the Module 2 assignment right up, you have a site model. So you can just open that. For most of you, it'll ask you to open it read-only, but this is what it is. Okay, it's really nothing special or fantastic. Okay, and in fact, depending on where you put your camera angle, you might even have to expand upon it. But it's a place to begin. Okay, so in most cases in the architectural design process, especially in the world of academia, you're going to be given a site, not the model, but you're going to have a site that you have to work within, and you're constrained by that site. So this is our constraint. The property line is right here. It's roughly, I think it was like 50 by 130 feet, something like that. So you can build anywhere within these boundaries. Actually, let me check the write-up again. I think there was something I added that might not have been in there. Oh yeah, I forgot about this one. The only real design, like specific design thing that I want to see from your designs is that you're providing access at the street level, right? So you need to actually think about your architecture and have it integrated into the site a little bit, okay? So that's really, really important because like a particular architectural feature that you need to see, and in this case, I've only asked you for really one. So naturally, it's going to be very important in your renders. it makes it kind of challenging because your camera and like not only does your design have to respond to all of the constraints of the site, but you also have to set your camera in a way that it can communicate both the architecture of your building and the thing that you're trying to highlight, if that makes any sense. So, so anyway, this is really it. I need to run you guys through a few things that we're going to do with this before I release you to start designing things. So just hang tight. But the 80, I think I said it was 75 feet high, and this building right here is actually a little taller than that. So turn project off. So to give you a sense of how big your building is going to be, that's an 80-foot building, and so your building is probably, I think the site was roughly 10,000 square feet or a little bit less, which means if you're trying to create 35,000 square feet, you're going to need more than one story, right? It would be 4 or 5 stories. Okay, does that make sense? So yeah, we're going to get going on that, but before I sort of close this down and start moving into, like some technical preparation stuff, do any of you have any questions? None. None whatsoever.
I think because we're waiting.
Yeah. Waiting to see what else you're going to do.
Yeah.
We don't want to ask you questions. We think you're about to tell us it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, you could ask me the questions, and then maybe it leads me into telling you it. So.
One question.
Yeah.
How you said you were giving us like the time constraints, like you say, oh, only like an hour and a half or something for design.
Yep.
So that's for this building.
Yep.
That we're doing?
Yep.
We're doing that this class.
Yep.
Oh, okay. That's my question.
Yep. That's going to happen today. I really do want to see that you guys can think through a simple design partie relatively quickly.
Okay.
Okay, because the rapid prototyping part of design, I think, is incredibly important, and it's it's not something I'm going to explicitly teach, but it is something that I think that you guys should be practicing from time to time. Okay.
Kevin?
Yes.
Do you know the password for the laptop?
Should be your login. Okay, hang on. I'll take a look.